Hello, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we've got Dr. Robert Miller on the call today, who is you know what, I'll just let you introduce yourself.
Okay, I'll do that. I'm Robert Miller, as Cash has said, and I am an associate professor of religious studies at Mount St. Mary College in Newburgh, New York, where I teach a variety of courses. I teach Intro to Biblical Studies, Old Testament, New Testament, Gospel of John, Book of Revelation. Those are all in my discipline. Plus, I also teach some other things like uh, theology of film, introduction to Christian prayer, world religions, and Beyond Narnia. It's a course on C.S. Lewis, which I created myself, which I really enjoy.
That's
So,
amazing.
yeah.
Yes, C.S. Lewis is amazing. So this is your life's work, or was this after something?
Well, that's a great question because, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, in high school, the last thing that I ever thought I would do was go to college. I hated
Oh,
school from first grade on. I was a terrible student. My dad told me, he said, "You fail one thing, you're off the wrestling team." So that meant 70 was my benchmark. And so I have a high school transcript filled with 70s. And so I never thought about going to college until I felt like I was called to priesthood. I was called to
oh.
seminary. And
At what age was that?
22. I was a 22-year
Very
old
young.
freshman. And so there I started studying something finally that I enjoyed, and that was studying about God and learning about God and, uh, preparing for a life of ministry, which I decided against. I discerned that that was not quite, but I fell in love with theology at the time. So then I went on for my master's degree. I had studied my undergrad at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania, where I majored philosophy and theology, and then went on for theology at Seton Hall University. And then I did my PhD in biblical studies at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
So, but no, I never thought that I would. A lot of PhDs, professors, they have what they call imposter syndrome. I definitely suffer from imposter syndrome. It's the whole idea. It's like, what am I doing here with all these smart people? You know. So, but I found out that there are other people here too that suffer from that same syndrome, and I consider them quite smart. So, not that I belong, but I'm just saying.
Hey, I think it's natural to have doubts, but you took a
Yeah.
very unique approach to it. I mean, Christianity in film, Introductory to Prayer, C.S. Lewis, that's pretty far reaching.
Yeah. Well, I really like the cultural aspects too. Like some things like theology and film and Beyond Narnia, C.S. Lewis. I mean, uh, we find God in all things and in all ways, right? So,
Yeah.
um, what I like teaching about theology and film is that there's these ordinary movies, which people would not think are necessarily religious, and they're not overtly religious, but they contain that theme of Christianity of the hero. Like what does
Yeah.
a Hollywood Christ figure look like? And so I'll show things like Beauty and the Beast, or Sleeping Beauty is another great one from Disney. Then shows like The Truman Show and things like that. They have these really wonderful themes in these movies, which have a
Wow.
great message. And from that movie, then you can just use that as a springboard to talk about Christian theology.
Wow. You didn't say any of the examples I thought you would. I thought you would for sure say The Matrix, with like the chosen one.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. That's along the lines of Superman too. It's a
Oh, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, but there's tons of movies that
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
that you can bring into there. So I try to keep them interesting. And
Yeah, absolutely. And I
yeah,
love that you're taking a very covert way to Christianity rather than like, starting with Noah or, the Passion of the Christ. Those are in your face Christian. And I would argue those
right.
are some of the better Christian movies
Yeah,
compared to some of the other ones out there. But yeah,
that's
I think that
correct.
is good practice to kind of see. the story of the hero and Christ as the hero and more things. I mean, arguably
Right.
some more Christian music that isn't in your face Christian, but still is worshiping someone and is a love song. Some of the
Right.
better Christian
Yeah.
songs.
Yeah. And what's the Song of Songs? It's it's love poetry at its root.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mention God, but it's all about God at the same
Yeah.
time. So it's really beautiful. So I love that intersection between theology and culture and things like
Yeah.
that, and
That is
spirituality.
amazing. And
Yeah.
Revelations. I mean, that is a whole other podcast that I may or may not drag you back for because that's a whole,
We'll
I
see
have,
how this one goes first, right?
right, right. Yeah, we'll see. Jury's Verdict still out. But oh my gosh, Revelation in itself. I mean, I spoke to a pastor in Southern California and he was talking about Revelation is one big revelation that God is, everything within that book is really just to bring heaven down to earth. But I think that a
Exactly.
lot of people get caught up in the plagues and the fire and the antichrist. I mean, I definitely do. I used to have nightmares about it as a kid.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there's so many different ways of interpreting the book, and I think they each have their own benefit. I just think that some are probably more legitimate than others. But I think you always kind of want to begin with, okay, what was the author trying to say? Just let's just start with that. What was the
Yeah,
symbolism he was using? What was the imagery? What's the literary form that he's writing in? You know,
absolutely.
and just begin with that before we start coming up with a date for the end of the world. You know? So,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I absolutely, another conversation, but just
sure,
kind of on that same topic of who is the author, let's talk about John.
sure.
So you
Um,
specialize in John mostly from the wedding in Cana, or
yeah, my doctoral dissertation was on Jesus's response to his mother at the wedding at Cana.
which is
So,
quite controversy.
yeah, well, I'll tell you, when I knew I had a dissertation, um, I was translating John from the Greek, and I said, well, let me see, because there's no verb in the phrase. In the Greek it says tiamoi kai soy, and there's no verb there, right? So I was just curious. I looked at an English translation and said, oh, okay, what does this one say? And that one was different. I looked at a third. I go up to 12 different English translations, and all of them had a different translation.
And just for a
So,
little bit of context, do you mind just overviewing what exactly the verse you're translating?
yes, it was uh, verse 3 says, uh, well, it's when the wine ran short, right? And then Jesus's mother says to him, um, they have no wine. That's verse 3. They have no wine. And Jesus responds to her with this Hebrew idiom, which is mali volak in the Hebrew and timoi kaisoi in the Greek. And he says, literally, what to me and to you. That's so there's no verb there. So if you're going to translate it literally, it's what to me and to you. And so all these English translations kind of force the translator's opinion into the text, and that's why you have 12 different translations. Now, what's really interesting is that same Greek phrase, the Hebrew idiom translated into Greek, occurs elsewhere, like it occurs twice in Mark's gospel. But of those same 12 translations, they only come up with two different translations. So it's very interesting how controversial the wedding at Cana has become with the translation of that
Yeah,
Hebrew
absolutely.
idiom in John 2:4. Yeah.
In John 2 4, I almost want to bring up the verse, but this is the verse where he kind of refers to his mother as woman.
Yes, that's right. That's the second part of the verse. So it's, what is it to me and to you, O woman, my hour has not yet come.
So he
Right,
refers to his mother as woman. And I think that a lot of almost English speakers in the English translation is why is he speaking to his mother that way?
right. But see, we're reading that as 21st century, you know, Americans. It's
Absolutely.
not derogatory at all. It's quite respectful at that time. And if you look at the John's Gospel, you see he refers to all women that way. Woman at the well, he refers to her as woman. So
Would that be
it's
like a
not.
modern day equivalent of like ma'am?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah, see, context matters.
Absolutely, it does. So
That's interesting. Okay.
yeah,
So the woman the wedding in Cana, but John is just writing from his perspective. So could we just kind of step back
sure.
and can you give me a little bit of background on like why does John get his own book? Where did John like why did John have a place in the Bible? And then just kind of like who was John before Jesus? Was he a fisherman? Was he
Yeah, yeah,
homeless? Was he rich?
yeah. So John was a fisherman. We know that from all four Gospels. We know that he and his older brother, he had an older brother, James, who was also one of the 12, and that they were the sons of Zebedee. Zebedee was their father. So,
Hmm.
um, and they had their own little fishing business, right? And
Some
um,
young entrepreneurs.
uh, well, that was kind of tough to do in the ancient world, particularly in that part of
Ooh.
the world. It wasn't, um, like we fish for sport here. We fish for relaxation. There's no. It was a job back then. You know,
Like
um,
survival.
that's right. So it was real kind of serious business. The job itself involved not just catching the fish, but also salting them, gutting
Oh,
them. Um, it involved selling them, fixing nets, fixing sails. There was a whole business to it, right?
yeah.
And you know the there was all different ways of catching fish too. I mean, like we use hooks. That's our common way. That when we go fishing by ourselves with a fishing pole, and
Yeah.
we can watch things like Deadliest Catch and things like that, which really kind of glamorizes the whole industry. But um, it was a real occupation in Cana in Galilee. In Galilee, I mean, I got Cana on the brain here right now, but fishing served really kind of as a major industry, and because of the availability of the Sea of Galilee, which was the only freshwater lake, in the area, right? So, unfortunately, the fishermen and the associated tradesmen with them were pretty much kept in poverty. The fee for fishing rights was quite high, and on top of that, the sale of fish and fish products was farmed out by King Herod,
Hmm.
to middlemen, who took their cut, and they took a
Hmm.
very high cut, and so it
Right.
wound up keeping the people who did the real hard work in poverty. So that's John's background, you know. So I always wondered, you know, what Zebedee must have felt when his two sons abandoned him. I mean, maybe he had more sense, but it's like, hey, this is the family business here, So I always wondered what his
Yeah.
reaction would have been.
Like I
I
love
mean,
that you're following the Messiah, but like could you have like
that's
found
right.
replacement?
That's right. Um, could you give?
Okay, so he was more
Excuse me.
like a poor lower class, not lower middle class,
Yeah,
under the Roman Empire.
they
Was
were
he
laborers. That's what they
oh, like
were, and just
poverty?
laborers. And yeah, I mean, everyone was poor. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
it's tough to talk about any real middle class there because you had the
yeah.
wealthy, and but everyone was kind of struggling to get what they can. So being a fisherman, they struggle. It was hard work to make a living, and we also know something about their mother, though. John's mother. Um, Remember, Jesus calls James and John sons of thunder. If
Oh,
you're familiar with that title, yeah, he calls
I'm
them
not.
sons of thunder. And a lot of people say, well, that's because they were strong, powerful men kind of thing, but there's this one scene in the Gospels, and occurs in two Gospels, and in one of them, the mother of James and John goes up to Jesus and says, "When you come into your kingdom, I want one son at your right hand and the other one at your left hand." Now
I
that's
remember that
pretty,
verse. Yeah.
yeah, that's pretty brazen, right? So I think she's the thunder. That's why they're sons of thunder. So but that's just speculation. There's no evidence on that. But
I mean,
but
a strong woman has to raise a bunch of sons, so
that's
that
right.
makes
And
sense.
strong
And
woman
those
raises
sons are
strong
kept in
sons.
check by her, so they clearly
That's right.
respect women.
That's
So
right.
I don't know. I mean, obviously the mom's a firecracker, but would you say that they sound young? I mean, let's start there. How old was John and James?
We don't know for certain, but it is. We do know that James was older,
Okay.
and we know that John was the youngest of the apostles, and he was
Okay.
likely a teenager, when he started following Jesus. So
Like 13 or 18? What do you mean by
uh,
teenager?
that's a good question, but he was
Okay, probably
probably
16.
probably on the older side of teenager. I doubt that he would have been, you know, um, in the young teens, but you know, people grew up quickly then. So,
Yeah.
and
Okay, so a teenager leaves his home with his brother and starts following the Messiah. So somebody that comes up is performing miracles. Did Jesus perform miracles to kind of get them on board, or what was their first interaction with Jesus?
well, that's a good question about why does Jesus perform miracles? Because the the Gospels really give two different answers for that.
Oh,
In the Synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, remember there's this one scene where it says Jesus.
I'm sorry,
Um,
what does synoptic gospels
synoptic. The
mean?
word synoptic refers to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Mm-hmm.
Those three Gospels, because they tell basically the same story with
Oh,
some differences. Like, for example, there are the infancy narratives are found only in Matthew and Luke, right?
of Jesus being born.
Right. But Matthew and Luke tell very different stories, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
whole idea of the Magi, that's in Matthew's gospel. It's Joseph. That Matthew's gospel is where Joseph is having dreams, and he knows to take the child and his mother to Egypt, and he knows when to return because of the dreams. That's nothing. That doesn't occur in Luke. Luke is they're going to Bethlehem because of the census, and there's no room for them at the inn, and the shepherds witness the angel, and they're greatly afraid, and the angel speaks to them and calms them, and so there's two very different stories, right?
Mm.
But when you look at the life of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the word synoptic itself means to see together or to see with. So you can put them in, and this has been done in books. We call them gospel parallels, where you can put the three stories in columns, right? And you can see that they're telling the same story, but they're telling some things differently. There's some points of interest which are different. And you can see that in John's gospel as well, because there are certain stories that, such as John chapter 6, which that story of the feeding of the 5,000 occurs in all four gospels, right? And that's
Yeah,
that's very rare that
yeah.
happens. Um, so when you look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's one story where it says Jesus went, but he could perform no miracles there because of their lack of faith, right?
Mm.
So in some context, the miracles are uh, performed based upon faith, whereas in John's gospel, he doesn't use the word miracles; he used the word signs, right? And that
Oh,
word signs really has a deep meaning in Judaism because it really kind of recalls the Exodus and Israel's salvation from slavery, right?
yeah.
So the signs are performed not based on faith, but to bring people to faith. In fact, John even makes that statement at the end of his gospel. He says, "Now Jesus did many other things." that are not written in this book, but these have been written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that you may have life in his name, right? So, um, so why does Jesus perform miracles? Well, it all depends on who you're reading, you know. So
Yeah.
sometimes they were performed based upon someone's faith, and other times the signs, the other miracles were done to bring people to faith. So
I absolutely know what you're talking about. I feel like, yeah, a lot of times it is because of your faith. The woman that touched just the hem of his coat,
yes,
or the man that sent his soldier to, talk to Jesus to heal his sons. But
that's right.
then again, you have women at the well who has no idea who Jesus is, but here he is telling her all about her life, and she has faith in
Right,
that.
right,
That
exactly.
so it sounds like the perspectives from every gospel matter. Just the way that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John viewed Jesus individually, they all differed. And it sounds like from John's perspective, he adored Jesus. Was it he the one that saw Jesus as Messiah? So one saw Jesus as man, one saw him as the Son of God, one saw him as the Messiah. Am I getting that correctly?
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
look it up.
So if no, you're absolutely right. In fact, if you really the what we call the Christologies of each gospel, so that's what is their portrait of Jesus? What is their portrait of Jesus? How is he portrayed? It really all comes from their uh, perspective on the crucifixion. Those are really the oldest parts of the gospel. So in Matthew's gospel, you look at the crucifixion and the whole trial, and what is Jesus? He's the royal Messiah, right? He's the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies. What about the portrait of Jesus in Mark's gospel? Well, he's the abandoned Messiah. He's crying out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Right? Then if you go to Luke's gospel, um, what's the portrait of Jesus on the cross? He's the forgiving Jesus. He's the merciful Jesus. He's the Jesus telling the the good thief, as we call him. I assure you, this day you will be with me in paradise. And he as they're mocking him, and he says, "Father, forgive them." Those are only in Luke. Those
Wow.
passages. And then what happens when you come to John? What's the portrait of John, or the portrait of Jesus in John's gospel? He is he is certainly divine. Um, uh, he is he is the Messiah who is always in control. And I always there was a Budweiser commercial. I'm going to make this really simple, but many years ago, probably back in the 1980s, there was a Budweiser commercial with this one dog, and the dog's name was Spuds McKenzie, right? And the dog, of course, in a beer commercial, it was surrounded by beautiful women. This dog was, right? And the whole point of the commercial was to say that he's a party animal, but he's always in control. And I'm like, that is the Jesus of John's gospel. He's this party at where is he? He opens up and you see he's at a wedding banquet, right? He's at a wedding banquet. He's producing wine. There's so much wine there, they fill it to the brim, right? And what happened? Multiplication of loaves. There's 12 baskets left over, right? But what happens? This is the key to understanding the Jesus in John. He's in control of all the events of his life, right? He is on trial before Pontius Pilate. And Pilate says to him, "Do you not know that I have the power to release you or the power to crucify you?" Now remember, up to this point, Jesus has been totally silent, not answering a thing. And when he hears that, he says, "You would have no power over you if it were not given to you from above." So he's like, "You don't
That
know
is a
what power is."
wild thing to say to like
Yes, when you're on
the guy
trial.
in charge.
That's right, when you're on trial. And when does Jesus die? He doesn't die until he says it is finished, right? He's in
Wow.
control of everything right up to the very moment of his death. And so
Yeah.
that's the Jesus that is portrayed in John's gospel. Um, he's alive, he's with it. He is God become man, and he is in total control. You want to know what do you take out of that? It's like, okay, my life is madness, right? But God is the one that's in control, right? So this picture that you get from John of Jesus is very reassuring. You know,
Yeah. It's arguably the best book to start with.
yes, that's a good way of putting it. That's correct. Yeah,
Because, I mean, it sounds like, so just to kind of sum it up, John is a 16-year-old kid. Let's just go with that because that's a pretty prominent time in your life.
yeah.
A 6-year-old kid, he's working hard. If he lived in 2023, he would be kind of working like a dog. He'd probably be like a mechanic. Do you feel like just like kind of working all night, working all day, just like working hard for his family?
He's a tradesman, right? So
Tradesman.
he's a tradesman. So he he works hard, and tradesmen today get paid a lot. He doesn't get the reward that tradesmen today get, but that's he's definitely a blue collar guy. You know.
Okay. Okay. Maybe like waiting for work outside Home Depot, waiting for someone to pick him up, kind of like a day laborer.
Well, no, I wouldn't go that far. he's just
Oh,
he's just no, he's just he's a tradesman, a
okay.
tradesman. So
Okay. Yeah.
whatever that could be, plumber, that could be, uh, electrician, bricklayer.
Oh, yeah. I would kill to be a plumber, electrician. Those guys get paid so much.
I know.
John would be doing well today, actually.
Yes, you're right. Yes, he certainly would be.
Okay. So he's very young, he's working very hard, he's skilled, and he meets Jesus with his brother, and Jesus performs a miracle for them? Or how does Jesus kind of, I don't want to say convert, but kind of get him on his
Oh,
team?
well, it's all the result of John the Baptist. We can thank John the Baptist for that,
Who is
because
not the John we're talking about?
no, he's a different John. That's correct. So, but John, the evangelist, John the fisherman, John the brother of James, and sons of Zebedee and sons of thunder, they were followers of the Baptist. And
And the
uh,
Baptist was a pretty radical guy.
he was, and so he was very attractive. And
John or the Baptist?
John the Baptist is the one I was talking about.
You mean attractive as like his message just allured people, or do you think physically
if
attractive? I
you're
thought he
if
looked wild.
Right, exactly. So, but that's an attractive thing, right? Right. When you see someone acting, wild, it's like a train wreck. You can't take your eyes off it. So somehow
Maybe
you
we're
just have to
attracted to
look.
different things, Bob.
Well, I guess so. But no, but
So he was in. He was
he
like, this
was,
is good. I
yeah.
love
But
John the
he's
Baptist.
he's
He's saying some
preaching
cool things.
repentance. John the Baptist is. He's preaching repentance, and he's out in the wilderness, and uh, John the evangelist, John the son of Zebedee, we'll call him for now,
Okay.
is attracted him. And remember, it is John the Baptist is the one who points to Jesus as the Messiah, and he says, "You guys got to follow him now. Okay,
Hmm.
he must increase and I must decrease." And
Hmm.
so we can thank thank John the Baptist for John and James coming to follow Jesus, right? And it's very
Oh,
interesting. And this is another thing that we can take with us, because the first words of Jesus, when he sees them following, and he says, "What are you looking for?" I mean, think about that. The first words of Jesus in John's Gospel are, "What are you looking for?" And that is the question that he asks all of us, right?
yeah.
So, and their response is what our response should be. It's like, "Where are you staying?" You know, and then he says, "Come and see." Those are those are the first words of
It's like
Jesus.
the most down to get down conversation I've ever heard in my life.
That's right. Yeah.
What do you want? Wherever you want. All right, let's go.
That's right. So
Okay, so they were actually so local guys, laborers, following John the Baptist. So they were like in search of something bigger than themselves. They were already following John the Baptist, who at that time was seen as a radical. I mean, he was wearing a loincloth, he's eating bugs and eating raw honey, he's baptizing people, he's saying just as crazy things of his cousin Jesus. And then when he points at Jesus and says, "No, this is the guy you want to follow," they just kind of pivot and start going with Jesus.
Right. So he points him out. He says, "Behold the Lamb of God." Right now, that's now for you and me. It was like, if you're calling some guy a lamb, like I don't know if that's someone like now you call him the goat, right? Today you call someone the goat. What's that mean? He's the greatest of all time. It's like how times have changed. So,
Yeah,
but to
yeah,
be when you're called the lamb, that meant something for the Israelites. The lambs offered for the sacrifice, and the Passover lamb, the lambs in the temple. Um, that's not just John the Baptist talking about Jesus's personality. Oh, he's mild as a lamb. No, no, no. That's a Christological title that he's giving him right there. That's identifying who he is as the
yeah.
Christ. You know. So
So would be calling someone a lamb back then mean that you were gentle, or would that be like you are the
no,
pinnacle, the quintessential, you are the best of the best? Well, also there is that symbolic that he is the lamb sent from God, the sacrificial
right.
lamb.
Yeah.
Do people typically call each other lambs back then?
I
Was
don't
that a
think
thing?
so. No, I've never been anything about that. I don't think so. So, but it's just a strange thing to call someone, don't you think? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. But the other thing is when you look at chapter 1 there in John's gospel, where he gives him this title, you see that there's all. If we had nothing else, we had just chapter 1 of John's gospel. We didn't have anything from chapter 2 to the end. We had no other gospels. We would know an awful lot about what the early church thought about who Jesus was just by the titles that they give him in chapter 1. You just go through it, and I don't know how many titles, I forget how many titles he's giving. You are the king of Israel. You are, you know, uh, you know, son of God. Or you're all these different, like they're escaping me right now, but because it just popped into my head, like you have all these different titles that are you're the one spoken about in Moses and the prophets. Um, so we would know an awful lot about
Yeah.
who he is just from chapter 1.
Yeah. Chapter 1, verse 45. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph."
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's called Rabbi. He's
Here
called.
truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit.
Yeah.
My gosh, what a brag. Oh my gosh. What an intro. Okay, so I love this. I feel like the book of John is just full of love and it's like steeping with love. But also because it seemed like Jesus liked John more than he liked the others. Isn't
Um.
John the one that Jesus loved and he like outwardly says that this is the one I like most?
Yeah. So I guess the question is, along the lines of, what does that title mean? He's called the beloved disciple, right?
Yeah.
And it depends on how you translate that. Uh, um, some Bible translations or versions will translate it as the beloved disciple or the disciple whom Jesus loved. But we see, why he had such an affinity for John. It may have just been because he was the youngest, and he knew that he was going to live the longest and have such an influence on the church. Um, so, um, so we see that there's several places in there that we see a reference to the beloved disciple. One of them is when Jesus is on the cross, right?
Oh,
Yeah, and that's really the first one. So it's in John chapter 19, Jesus is on the cross, and he says to John, he says, "Behold your mother," or to his mother, he says, "Behold your son." And then it says, from that moment on, that disciple took her into his home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have
Mm-hmm.
um, at the end of the gospel, you have the resurrection. I'm trying to think right now.
There's
Uh,
also, I'm just looking at some verses. I'm on a different tab right now, cheating. But
oh, it's
I'm
okay.
looking at some verses and it says just a little bit lower down. So John 19, you just said John 19:27, and to the disciple, here is your mother. From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. And then the death of Jesus, we're at John 19:35, or
Right.
I'll do the verse before John 19:34. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing out a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may also believe. Are they talking about John right now?
Yes. Well, that's all controversial in scholarship itself. The Gospel of John. You know, authorship is um, a big point of debate. Um, I would fall into the category of scholars who would say it's John the Apostle, without a doubt. And I think that there's just not enough evidence to say that John the Apostle had nothing to do with this writing. There are people who would say, there's so many different candidates. Um, um, some have even suggested John the Baptist as the author, which I find very impossible to believe since he's beheaded. but but you get scholar; these people get published, which is, I guess, the whole key. But um, I guess that is the question. Is the beloved disciple has to be one of the 12? And I think
Yeah.
it only makes sense that it's John. Certainly, tradition, the a lot of the fathers of the early church, identified the beloved disciple as John, one
Yeah.
of the 12. Um, there's one particular early church father, Saint Irenaeus. And Saint Irenaeus, um, he was a second century bishop, Bishop of Lyon, and he, lived probably, most of his life in the second century. So, like, from like 120 AD, probably to the end of that century somewhere. Could have gone into the next century, but probably died right around the turn of the century. But he identifies the beloved disciple as the disciple of the Lord who leaned upon his breast at the Last Supper, right? So now, what I love about Saint Irenaeus is his connection to the apostle himself. What is that connection? The connection is that Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. And Polycarp, or St. Polycarp, was the bishop of Smyrna. And Smyrna was one of the 7 churches that the book of Revelation was written to. And so Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle himself. So you have John the Apostle at the end of the first century. He brings Polycarp into the faith, and Polycarp in turn brings Irenaeus into the faith. All right. So, and Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, one of the 7 churches that the book of Revelation is written to. So that's why I love reading Irenaeus. And certainly not everything Irenaeus says is, plausible, but he has this connection to one of the 12 apostles. So and there's just so many other of the early church fathers. Eusebius, if you read the writings of Eusebius, he was a historian, and he also, by citing other sources, argues that John the Apostle was the author of the 4th gospel and the beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. So
Interesting.
And so, so why did he love John? He may have loved his youthful innocence. You know what I mean? It's like, here's a guy who has, all the right intentions, but boy, he needs to grow up, and so we don't know. We don't know,
Interesting.
but
It's interesting that it's unclear why that wouldn't
yeah.
just be specified. I mean, I'm looking at the verse that you keep referencing with the Last Supper, and it looked like, John 21, verse 20, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, "Look, Lord, who is going to betray you?" And when Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" So it's just consistently referring to him as the
Yes.
one. Why was that so? This is, I don't know. Is there like a lot of meaning here? Why is it a big deal that John allegedly leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper? That seems like a pretty small thing.
Well, it shows the closeness of them
Oh,
as well. So, I mean, and when you, okay, so, um, you know, if we get a table for 12, I mean, we're we're sitting, with the high tables and chairs, and we're all given our space, right? Because you don't want someone who's left-handed sitting to your right, all this stuff. We want our space, but in the ancient world, the way they would have eaten dinner, supper, right, would have been, sitting on the floor, maybe with some cushions or something like that, and reclining on one elbow, right? So if you're reclining on your left elbow, you'd be eating with your hands, with your right hand, right? That's the traditional way. So now think about it. If John is to his right, to Jesus' right, John is already leaning close to Jesus by leaning on his left elbow. Okay, so he would have been right in the proximity, right close to Jesus to be able to do that.
hmm.
So, but remember too, to be what was the request of the mother of James and John, right? To have one sit on your
I
right
was
and
about to
one sit on your
say.
left. Yeah. So John was definitely to Jesus's right. We don't know if James was to the left or what, uh, but but John definitely was close, and so that was definitely a sign of affection, a sign of favoritism. So it's good.
Yeah,
But that
absolutely.
story that you bring up about John, about Peter um, turning and seeing uh, the one who reclined on Jesus's chest and says, "What about him?" Right? If you read that, um, do you have it in front of you?
I do, I do. Yeah.
Okay,
So,
read that
um,
passage. It's a great
yeah.
passage.
Okay, I'll do a little bit before and a little bit after. So we'll just start at, oh, it kind of, yeah, John 21, verse 17 to 22. We'll do that. The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him the third time. "Do you love me?" He said. "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger and you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." How does Peter die?
Peter dies by means of crucifixion as well.
Ugh,
Yeah,
doesn't
only
he?
only he is upside down.
I was about to say.
Yes.
Ugh. Okay, so still talking about
So
Peter. Oh yeah,
so
go ahead.
in John 21, it's after what you read, right?
Yeah.
So you read that part about Peter being reinstated, because remember Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and so 3 times now he's being brought back in. Jesus asked Peter three
Mm,
times, "Do you love me?" Right? So he's kind of like reinstating Peter, and it's right after that because he says, "Follow me."
mm,
Right? That's the last thing he said, and then you have this encounter with Peter and the beloved disciple, right?
mm-hmm,
Beginning in verse 20,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yep. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one that who had leaned against Jesus at the supper and said, "Lord, who's going to betray you?" And when Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" And so
Yeah.
Jesus
What about
answered,
him? It
What about
doesn't,
him?
it doesn't say what about John, or what about what about him? It's like talking about me right in front of my face, kind of thing. You know, um, but he says, what about him? And
Jesus
Jesus said to
answered,
him, what if I want him to remain until I come? What about that? What are you going to do? Right? So it's funny if you think about how this interaction is taking place. And he says, what concern is it of yours? Just follow me. Right?
yeah,
So the word spread among the brothers that the disciple would not die. Now, how you get that? I mean, but Jesus had not told him that he would not die. Just what if I want him to remain until I come? What concern is of yours? Now, the reason I find that um, little interaction interesting is because there was actually a legend that John the Apostle did not die.
what?
It was there was it's an apocryphal story. So it's not true. I don't know of anyone who believes it. Um, but it's especially interesting that there was this legend that John was given the same privilege as Enoch and Elijah, that he was taken up into heaven like Enoch and Elijah was. But there's no evidence for this, and like I said, it's really just a legend that no one really believes. But your question, how what was John's cause of death? What? Well, that wasn't it. there there was so I think that there was the fact that there's this interaction between Peter, Jesus, and John, and this belief that comes out of it that he would not die, and then somehow after John does die, this legend, this apocryphal story comes about, which said that he was taken up into heaven like Elijah and Enoch. So
Is John's death recorded in the Bible or
no, no, uh, it is not recorded. Um, so what we have is historical evidence of the early church fathers, martyrologies, and things like that, which would be, we know of the 12 apostles that 10 died by martyrdom, right? Um, Judas took his own life, so that's 11. And then we have John, who is likely the only one to have died of natural causes. Now, there's another story about John and how he came to be exiled. Now, he was certainly arrested. He was brought from Ephesus to Rome. He stood trial. And
this is after Jesus' death?
yes, this is after Jesus' death. This is, toward the end of John's life. And so what's going on? You have John's gospel and his other writings, the book of Revelation. These are all written, probably in the last decade of the first century. So what's going on there? You have the persecution under the Emperor Domitian. Okay, and he reigned from probably about I think it's like his years are probably around 81, I think it is, to 96. So so he has John brought to Rome. He stands trial, and John was sentenced to a real gruesome death. And whether this story is true or not, who knows? But he
Is
was
this in the Bible or where was
no,
this?
this is not in the Bible. No.
Huh, where is it
So
at?
it's in someone's writings. Like the name escapes me right now. I can't. But he supposedly was to be boiled in oil, and so this is in the Colosseum, and the fire is lit, the oil is heated, and John is brought out, and he is thrown into the oil, and then the miracle happens where he is totally unfazed, right? People see this, many convert, and as a result of that, now remember this, we don't have any hard evidence for this, but this is how he becomes exiled to Patmos, right? So he stood trial. There's an attempted death, uh, attempted scene of martyrdom, but even so, he winds up on Patmos, and that's where he has his vision of the apocalypse. So, but after that, after the death of Domitian, and this we do know, after the death of Domitian, John is then released. He goes back to Ephesus, where he spends the rest of his life and there dies of natural causes.
That was a wild story.
Yeah, it is, but you take that with a grain of salt. We don't know that to be true. So
Ah,
anyway,
that's hard. You want that to be true. That's an epic
you
story.
do, because people see that, and according to the story too, people convert. They see the miraculous, and it also demonstrates how hardened people's hearts can become too. Now, if Domitian knows that he was survived being thrown into oil, wouldn't that make you convert, right? But Pharaoh didn't convert, right? Releasing the Israelites, he saw the attacks on all the Egyptian gods and still didn't convert, you know. Um, so people with hardened hearts, they're a tough catch, But as long as
I don't know.
anyone's
If
open,
I saw someone boiled like a beignet and come out unscathed, I that's pretty hard to deny.
yes, it is for you and me. But for other people, it's a magic trick, you know.
Yeah.
So
What was the vision of the apocalypse? I don't want to skip over that.
the entire book of Revelation
Oh,
is,
that was by John?
yes, yes. So
Oh,
John's exiled on Patmos, and he's the one that has the vision of the book of Revelation. Yeah.
I
So
didn't
so the
know that
book.
John was the
So
author of the
the
book of Revelation.
I'm sorry.
I didn't know that John was the author of the book of Revelation.
Yes, well, you'll get debates among scholars over that as well, but it's attributed to John. In fact, but the author even mentions his name. He goes, "I John," right? So, but the question is it the same John?
Is there
So
another John?
oh, there's lots of Johns.
It's a pretty uncommon name.
Yeah. So, um, but some people, they would argue even that the gospel itself went through several editions, which
Mm.
we can see evidence of that. So we don't have to argue that John um, penned every word in the order that it is, but to deny Johannine authorship outright, which some people do, I find very difficult to believe. Um, and some of the people would argue that the book of Revelation is written by a different John. Again, I don't think that there's any um, conclusive evidence that would argue against it. You can make some good arguments, but I think even those arguments fall short a little bit. So, for example, some people will say, "Oh, well, um, the author of the Apocalypse uses a different word for lamb than the author of the Gospel." And I say, that's legitimate. But if you look at the language or the words that John uses in his own gospel, you see that passage that you read about, "Do you love me?" Well, in the Greek, there's two different words for love being used, right? There's phileo and there's agape. Philein. So, "Do you love me?" So, two different words for love. We see that with the word for to see in John's gospel. Sight is very important. It's really a euphemism for faith, right? To be able to see
What?
um, in John's gospel. Yeah. So the healing of the blind man, right? What he's doing, he's not just getting his vision back; he's coming to faith. is what's happening there. That's John chapter 9, right? But see, even in there, John is using different words for the word to see. In one case, he uses blepo, and in other words, he uses orao. So there's different words. And the same thing for the
Whoa.
word to know. The word to know, gnosko or oida. There's different words, and he goes back and forth using these words synonymously
Yeah.
with no real structure to them, or no real, uh, there's no set pattern. He just kind of uses them interchangeably. So,
Yeah.
so the fact that someone would say, the author of the Book of Revelation or the Apocalypse, uses different words. Well, I say, that's legitimate until you see the way the author of the Gospel uses words. So,
Right,
um,
right, right.
yeah.
Man, now I just want to start talking about Revelations, but
Well, we can't.
not
That's
this
another
time.
one.
Next
That's
time.
another whole thing.
Next time. Well, I enjoy these conversations clearly. I mean, you're a fantastic speaker, but just for somebody who might be listening and has more questions than I do you think you have any like books or just resources you could point them towards to kind of continue their education on this topic?
Um, um, you stumped me here. Um,
That's okay. We can take this out if you can't think of any.
there's some um, very good commentaries, um, both Catholic and Protestant. I always like going to the ancient. I forget what it's called. Ancient commentary. I forget what it is, but it's actually a Protestant um, publication, but it actually refers a lot to a lot of the early church fathers and their interpretations, just so you can kind of see how they do it. Word biblical commentary, I think, is very good. Um, if you're looking for something a little more heady, um, you know, um, Anchor Bible commentary. I'm not thrilled with that commentary on the Book of Revelation, though, and I hope she's not watching. but um, but there's some. I'm sorry. I'm just. I have the Ignatius Bible commentary. I think is very good.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Those are the kind of the sources that I go to. Ignatius Bible commentary. And I can't. You've really stumped me here, catching me
That's
off guard.
okay.
So, trying to think. What do I have behind me? Oh, Navarra Bible commentary. uh, yeah. So, gotta go back look at my sources. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Scan your library and then get back to me.
Yeah.
And I just want to make this an available resource for anybody because if you've got a book of the Bible and then you wrote another book of the Bible, you're clearly worth learning about. And
Plus
it's good
three
to be.
letters. We
What
didn't
do you
even
mean?
talk.
What?
There's first, second, and third epistle of John as well. So
Okay.
so next to Paul, who wrote 13, at least 13 letters. Some argue 14. You have John, who has 5 books attributed to him. So
Oh boy, we're gonna have a couple more podcasts, guys.
that's good.
Well, this has been great. I mean, I think just I'm the youngest of my family, and
Me
it's
too.
so hard. Oh, look at that. It's so
Yeah.
heartwarming to know just like the love that God has for the youngest, the most curious, maybe even, I don't know. I want to believe that John was a little silly. It's just, he kind of got the better end of the stick. He didn't get crucified upside down. So you can think
Sure.
that he lived a good life and he
Right.
avoided being boiled. So, um, yeah, I would like to think that I'd be friends with John if he was alive today in 2023.
Yeah, I would like to think that I would be as well. I think I'd have a lot of questions for him myself. So,
Yeah.
uh,
He seems like a bit of an activist if he's this involved in the Bible, I'm not gonna lie.
right. Right. So
Okay.
it's great.
Well, I appreciate your time. I hope that you come back because I still have more questions somehow. And I just appreciate your insight. You're a great speaker, so thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate your inviting me to be part of this conversation. It was great. Thank you so much. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too.
Okay.